Um, my name is Gabrielle, and I'm a PhD student here in the Sustainable Development Program, and I'm interested in gender economics and health and the intersections, so I'm very excited about your talk today. So let me now present her. Gabrielle Oliveira's research focuses on immigration and mobility, on how people move, adapt, and thrive across borders. Her expertise includes gender, anthropology, transnationalism, and bilingualism with a concentration on Latin America. Merging the fields of anthropology and education through ethnographic work in multiple countries, Oliveira also studied the educational trajectories of immigrant and first-generation children. Oliveira received her bachelor's degree in the native Brazil and earned her master's and doctoral degrees from Columbia University, where she was also National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation dissertation. In the work that she's presenting today, entitled Motherhood Across Borders, she focuses on Mexican women who immigrate to New York City and leave children behind. She examines parenting from afar, as well as the ways in which separated siblings cope with different experiences across borders. Drawing on more than 3 years of ethnographic research, Gabrielle Oliveira offers a unique focus on the many consequences of maternal migration.
Thank you. This sounds so much better than I would describe myself. So it's a nice pick-me-up, right? Well, thanks everybody for being here, and thank you for the invitation. I was myself an attendee of this event, and I was a discussant, not too long ago. So it's pretty amazing to come full circle and come back home. In terms of being in this very classroom where I took classes with some of my favorite professors and learned so much, and a lot of my interest sparked by being here, getting a fellowship to travel through ELAS, and so I owe so much of where I am today to this community here. So since there's not too many of us, I'll try to do this in I won't talk for too long, so that we can have more of a discussion with questions and answers. So I'll try to keep myself, 35 minutes, if that's okay. If I see that I'm losing people along the way, I don't know, I'll make a joke and keep going. What I'd like to do today is, this is the title of my upcoming book that is going to be released in the summer, Motherhood Across Borders. And as you very well said this is over 3 years of ethnographic work. I'm an anthropologist by training. So the way that I looked at this, the way that I took this research was a lot of field work more than survey data. There's a bit of survey data, but I was really, I like to say that this type of research took muscle, because I recruited women from one side of the border here in New York City, and then I tracked their kids and the grandparents in Mexico, and they were everywhere in Mexico. They were in Veracruz, in Hidalgo, in Morelos, in Mexico State, in Oaxaca, everywhere. So I kind of had to do a lot of traveling there, but I kept the center as New York City as the recruitment place. So today what I want to talk about are really these 3 pieces that are really part of the narrative and a part of my research, which the first one is the feminization of migration and the gender nexus. So basically this argument that we have a lot, which, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, how a lot of development policy, a lot of humanitarian aid policy, you see the language that people depend on women, right? So if you concentrate on women, if you have women do this work, if you have women take the children to school, if you have women take children to get vaccinated, then you can solve all the world's problems. So we're putting so much pressure and so much at stake on this development nexus on depending on women, but we're not really acknowledging how they move and what happens when women move, right? Because the work of women really never finishes. So you may have one woman moving, but there's going to be another one that's going to doing a similar work that she was doing. So how do we, think about that? Then transnational care constellations, which is a way that I developed, so it's a methodology that I developed to understand families and how families organize themselves across borders. The idea of using constellations is really because if you take an astronomy take on this, if you look at the sky, you can't really see all the stars, right? So you think about constellations, and it's the same way with family. it can keep going on and on and on and on, but you have to slice it in a particular way, and the way that I did is to look at care. So who's taking care of children across the borders? Then finally, a gap in the research that I identified earlier on was that we don't really talk about, and I'm using we loosely here in terms of migration and migration scholars, talk about the children, right? So when we use terms like children left behind, brought with, born here, and to me it always sounds like you're talking about luggage. It's such a terrible term in terms of how you place children, and you really remove the agency that children have all throughout this process, which they do. And then, so looking at the education experiences in the end was interesting to me to kind of compare how children that are here, born here in the US, and the children that stayed in Mexico, but they share the same parents, right? They share the same biological mother, which is at the center of this transnational care constellation. How are they faring at school? Because a lot of the migration, the narrative that these women, have from leaving Mexico and coming to the US has to do with sacrifice, right? So I came here because I want to give you a better life. And that holds a lot of symbolism and a lot of, the narrative of life, but it's also much more complex than that. It's a really easy trap to just say, it's the reason women came. No, there's more to that. But it's hard for women to discuss their identity as not being mothers, right? So motherhood is usually how they describe themselves first, and then a woman that has their own desires and wants and wills will come second. So in all my interviews, when I was talking, to women, first interview, I would ask, so why did you come to the United States? Because I want to provide a better life for my child. Okay, so then second interview, third interview, fourth interview, and as we go, other things come up. Because I was in an abusive relationship. Because I had my child when I was 16 years old and nobody would marry me, so I wanted to leave that town. Because there was nothing for me there and I wanted an adventure. But those things sometimes are not, it doesn't sound like something that you could put together with being a caring mother, right? So for them, discussing things that you want to do will go directly against this idea of the caring mother, and we can talk about Marianismo, in its many different forms in Mexico, but staying within that identity form is a trap of a narrative, right, in terms of thinking why women migrate and why they leave. So just quickly, the context of this. So when I was here at CIPA as a master's student, one of the internships that I took was with Finca, which does microfinance and microcredit services to different populations, and I went to Mexico with them, and a lot of I wasn't even looking for what I ended up looking for after, but there was a lot of conversation about ghost towns, and the ghost towns were usually comprised of grandmothers and younger children. So the people in their reproductive age were not there, right? And there was this discussion of they were here in the US. So not having that piece, that generation, however you want to call it, grandmothers were trying to think, well, I need to make money now that my kids are not here, right? And they would get some remittances, but remittances, as many of you may know, they're not constant, right? It really depends on what's going on with people's lives on the other side of the border. If you lose your job, if somebody else starts living with you in your small apartment in the South Bronx or in Jackson Heights, that's going to impact how much money you spend, thus it's going to impact how much money you send home. So all these things were variables that impacted remittance sending. And then these grandmothers were really trying to figure out how to survive and thrive in these, what they called ghost towns. So from there, I started thinking about the here and the there. And we can think about the here and there in many different ways, right? We can think here as being US-centric, so here, but we can also think about the here as in Mexico, as being, where it started, where people left from. So this family, for example, here in the picture, this side here is a family in Puebla, and this is the mother and the father who now live in Jackson Heights, and they left 3 kids with the grandmother, and then these are some cousins, and then there's also her sister also in the picture. So this is, the way that they lived, they call it the house of women, and it was a pink house of, everything that you can imagine. And they were talking about also, they wanted to know how to shoot guns, and defend themselves because they were saying that only women lived in this house, so they wanted to also figure out how to do that without the men. So historically speaking, migration to the US has been not just male-led, but from Mexico, but we've always, the bulk of the research has focused on men migrating to the US, and then when you see the 80s and early 90s, a lot more research on women migrating, and then this idea of the feminization of migration, right? So when we think about feminization of migration, it's what I was saying in the beginning, which is this idea of the global care chain, right? And the global care chain is what I started saying in the beginning, which is if a woman leaves Mexico and leaves her children in Mexico and migrates to the US, about 80% of the women that are migrants here, especially in New York City, are caregivers. So they're taking care of other children professionally. So they're nannies, babysitters. So if you think about the global care chain, then you have children left in Mexico that need to be taken care of by somebody. So the grandmothers take on that role. But then when they get here, these women are taking care of children so that mothers can go out to the labor market, right? And take on jobs as being teachers, lawyers, professors, you name it. You need somebody to cover that. So you have, instead of, when you discuss this idea about when women migrate, are they getting empowered, which is very extremely critical of the term. So are they getting empowered, or are the patriarchal norms being reproduced, right? Because in a way they're leaving a position in Mexico where they were taking care of these children, and then they arrive here and they're taking care of other children professionally, just not their own. So it's who's taking care of the of the nanny's children, right? And then who's taking care of them here in New York City and in Mexico as well. So this global care chain relies on women to do this work more than anything else. And that's the hidden part of the discussion, that it's usually not at the forefront. Because again, it's very, when we think about big data and all the stats on who migrates, we don't get to the specifics of what people are doing what. And this is where I think the contribution of doing this type of work lies on. Because you can see that these, when you think about the work of a woman and how it's associated with care, how do you solve that puzzle then? If everybody's taking care of another child, and there goes, an entire chain of events. For me to be here today in New York City, and I have 2 small children, it's because I am relying on help that it's not my parents and not my family, right? Because I'm from Brazil and they're very far away, so I'm relying on help that it's not my kin. So I couldn't be here if I didn't have that particular help, right? So it's something that is not just part of a particular place in society. It happens to most people. Why is it important for us to think about the feminization of migration in both sides of the border, right? Because what moves from one place, as I said, leaves a particular gap, or not just for women's work, but also a generational gap, right? So you end up having a lot of grandparents taking care of younger children, and some of them are incredibly young, and they're doing a lot of the work, and and they're up for it, and there's a lot of energy to do that. But there's a big part of them that would prefer not to be doing that work that they did 20, 30 years prior, right, to their children have migrated. And not only that, but the whole way of depending on that care that a mother here has is relying on grandparents there, right? So it puts a lot of pressure in the particular role that grandparents have there, and they depend on the remittances to kind of keep that relationship going, in the sense of paying for uniform, for books, because school may be public school, but you have to pay for a million things, as many of you may be familiar with. So this idea that the women here are relying on this care, this is the transnational care constellation that I'm talking about, is who's involved in the caretaking of these children. So this another piece of the family that is in Puebla in Mexico, which is one of the places that I was. And here on the left, Layla, on this left, you guys, but so she's taking care of 3 young girls, right? And the whole time that I'm there and I'm doing work with her and staying at their house, at this pink house, she's saying how she would really like if her daughter, who now lives in Jackson Heights would come to Mexico and be with her children. And she would say over and over, these are the best years. She's missing out on these great years to see her children grow. So the children listen and hear that narrative a lot. And they're the very beneficiaries of the migration of their moms. But that doesn't mean that they don't resent them, right? Because they didn't ask their parents and their mothers to migrate. They didn't ask for that to happen. But the mothers did that with the narrative of, I'm sacrificing this for you. So the power that holds in terms of a child's way of imagining the other side and thinking through what is migration and the anxieties and depression that brings with that in terms of I am now in this position that I have to deal with this reality. And the grandparents are very good at saying, you have to be thankful to your mom. You have to be thankful for what they're doing for you. Mm-hmm. And you have to, acknowledge that. And when there are phone conversations, that becomes part of how we communicate. So the first thing is the mothers will always ask, how are you doing at school? Are you going to class? Are you doing well? So the language is not just the money remittance, but there's a social remittance that is also part of your education attainment and how well you are behaving. So this idea of educación, and it's very similar to educação in Portuguese, which encompasses a lot more than schooling, right? So it's how you behave, how you dress, how you respect the elders, how do you, how you do homework, how you're on time. So there's an experience part of this that is not just related to schooling per se. So people are moving, right? And this is not just something that it's a Mexico-US thing, even though this is, this crazy graph that you see shows how people are moving from all over the world to different places. But in the case of Mexico to the US is still the thickest yellow piece right there, which is the flow from Mexico to the US. So it's still representative speaking, it's still a big chunk of people going that, and I'm happy to entertain some policy questions and talk about, what is going on with immigration policy within this administration and comparing to previous administrations in the US later on. So we don't get all political too quick, but which is impossible, but I'm trying. But it's this idea that people have been on the move and they've been migrating for a very long time, right? This is nothing new in terms of people moving. It's as normal as eating and breathing and drinking, right? People move for different reasons. But we've come to a moment in history that things are discussed as very much bordered and patrolled and surveilled, right? So this is a part of that will create this anxiety about not just, that we talked about quickly before I started, but there's really incredible work by this scholar called Joanna Draby, who talks about this idea of everyday illegal and what it means to live in this, with this cloud above your head, that you're not actually going to be deported, but the fear of deportation is actually the worst part, right? So you may have Joanna Draby, so it's D-R-E-B-Y is her last name. So kind of thinking about that, which is in the same way on the other side of the border, is the concern, right? So you have concern that families have, and they're divided. So before also, we used to see a migration that was a lot more what we used to call community-based migration from Mexico to the US. So you would have these migration corridors from Puebla to North Carolina, right? And then from Oaxaca to places in California, or from northern Mexico to Texas and Arizona. And here in New York, Puebla was, has been historically one of the major ones coming here, especially if you go to Sunset Park in Brooklyn, which is historically, a place where there's a lot of people from Puebla. But if you go to the South Bronx, it's mixed, right? So part of my research was in the South Bronx, in Jackson Heights, in East Harlem, and in Sunset Park. And if you see the demographics of how they are, in the South Bronx, you see people from Veracruz, and from Oaxaca, and from Hidalgo, and from all these different states in Mexico, and not necessarily a one community to community type migration. And part of that is because of housing, right? So when you have cheaper housing, you have newcomers going to places that are cheaper to live than to places that are more expensive to live, which then makes you have a more of a mixed place in terms of where people are coming from. Still in New York, Puebla is still very much where most people are coming from, but it's this idea of migration based on necessarily, from that community, this is where necessarily you're gonna end up. That's not necessarily what happens anymore. And people are really, this idea of family wanting to stay together and why people are migrating. We may think that family may be an outdated concept in terms of how we think about migration studies, but people crave being together, right? So I always say you can build a wall as high as you want. People are going to find out ways of coming through because there's something that is more important than, a risk that you may take in your life, which is to reunify with your parents and with your kids and with people that may be, a lot of the migrants here will go to Mexico, will take a risk and travel to Mexico and come back because they want to go to a funeral or they want to go see their parent be buried, or something that is also the meanings why people are taking risks like that. So this is what the transnational care constellation that I'm talking about looks like, right? So I have the mother in the middle, which this is the model based on mothers here in New York City. Throughout my research, we're the ones making all the decisions, not just here in New York City, but also in Mexico. So they wouldn't have seen their kids for 7, 10, 12 years that they had left Mexico and not seen their kids, but they would still be making decisions about what is going on in their everyday lives in Mexico. An example of that is one of the families that I worked with, the daughter, 6th grader in a small town in Mexico, didn't get along with her teacher. And she complained to her mother over the phone and over text message for a very long time. I don't get along with her. It's a problem. She's gonna fail me. It's a problem. What do I do? Then the mother said, well, you have to speak to your grandmother. And then she's like, well, I tried already. And my grandmother told me to speak with you. And this, keep in mind, this is in Puebla and New York, right? And they're making these decisions about everyday things that are happening. Finally, the mother here picks up the phone and calls the principal at this school and says, you're gonna move my kid from this classroom to another classroom. And the principal says, well, we only have one 6th grade classroom. So there's nothing, we can do here. And then she's like, well, I don't care. You're gonna have to figure out, because if you don't, I have an uncle who owns property behind the school and I'm gonna have him come and talk to you about this. And my father was the previous president of the town. And so it was an entire mobilization of power and resources, which what happened in the end was that this child got moved to 7th grade, but she was doing homework and coursework of 6th grader, but she was physically in another classroom, right? So the mother here, in many ways, won over the battle of who decides the everyday on the ground type of decisions. And this is the power. That's why I discussed this idea of motherhood across borders, right? Because these are women who haven't seen their children for 10, 12 years, and they're still making everyday decisions about what's gonna happen back in their hometowns, and they're respected for that, right? And there's no power dynamic that there's one person trying to take away the value of the mother in that particular situation. So as I said, I did transnational multi-sided ethnographic work, so I was jumping around quite a bit in Mexico. And then I focused on 20 families. And that's what I did for over 3 years, was with the women and the children that were born or brought over to the US here. And then in Mexico with the grandparents and the children that stayed in Mexico. On top of that, I did surveys, 250 surveys with children in primary schools and secondary schools in Mexico, and specifically discussing the impact of remittances in their lives. And I interviewed teachers and fathers, and then you see that, I have teachers and fathers kind of fluctuating within the transnational care constellation, because they would come in and out with different roles at different points, but they weren't fixed positions or roles in the lives of these particular children, right? So kind of, again, this idea of moving from a broader perspective in terms of a higher number of structured interviews to then this intermediate level of having key informants and less observations, to a very focused on unstructured ethnographic piece, which I spend most of my time with these families. So the themes that emerged, right? So the ideologies and practice of care and motherhood. So this idea that I talked about in the beginning, how they clash at many times. If we decide to talk about what is, care and motherhood and womanhood, and what does it mean to be a woman in the place of trying to migrate and leaving children, and how that is really part of a broader narrative. So parent-teacher conferences, which I went with parents here in New York, but also in Mexico. And what I saw was that you see grandmothers taking kids to parent-teacher conferences in Mexico, and their biggest fear is that they can't read or write, and they don't feel worthy of interacting with teachers in Mexico, right? So they don't look the teachers in the eyes, their heads are down, their demeanor is like, I don't know how to help my grandchild, I don't know what to do with my grandchild. And then you go to parent-teacher conferences here, like the ones I went in a few schools in the South Bronx, the parents are doing the exact same thing. They're looking down, they're not facing teachers in the eyes, they don't feel worthy of participating in their kids' education because they're undocumented, because they don't speak the language, and because they don't think they have the so-called skills to navigate the educational systems in the USA, right? So it's kind of thinking that even though they're living completely different lives, they're actually parallel in terms of how they're going through some of these issues in their lives. Then thinking about children's perspectives, and I'm going to show you some of the drawings that I collected from children and how present migration and this particular concept is for children in Mexico and how they think about the US, and that's a part of their daily thoughts in terms of being in contact with their parents. And now, you know, through Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and, you know, the other social networks tools that they have, they stay connected with their parents also through that, and it's a much faster back and forth to make decisions about smaller things in life than before. Then some of the social trajectories of separated siblings, so what happens with the kids that stayed in Mexico and the ones here, which for a lot of the discourse is the children that stayed in Mexico, they're looked at as orphans, as I said, left behind is a very pejorative term for, you know, what happens with them, and kind of thinking that they're not cared for. And then the ones that are here, well, they're in the US, so therefore they must have the best life and education, right? And most of the time that is actually the opposite way, because where most of these families are living are in these neighborhoods that are already problematic because they're under-resourced, they're already in the poorer parts of town, and the teachers are already overwhelmed. And, you know, there's a lot of institutionalized racism in how race and identity is discussed. So you add all of that into the fact that you're an immigrant family living in a neighborhood, right? So it doesn't make it easier to anybody. So looking at how they benefit from migration is an interesting piece as well. And then finally, this idea that girls in Mexico, they are performing better in school than their counterparts in Mexico and the kids that are born here. And a lot of that has to do with how they stay in touch with their mothers. So as I said, the language of success is really the language of I'm doing really well in school, right? And that keeps almost a lifeline with the mothers in Mexico. So if they say that on the phone, that has them, you know, more closer, and then the kids are thinking, well, if I do well here, I may get a visa, and I may be able to go study in the US. Even if that chance is the smallest possible chance, it's still part of the narrative of doing well in school. So when we think about, you know, the materials and kind of looking at collecting just not interviews but artifacts on both sides of the border, and looking at how schools and their experience are done, it's very different also in terms of the kind of help and discussions that they have in schools about immigration and how that's not part of the curriculum, right? So if we put women in the middle and have this, and we push this binary of this paradigm of they're empowered or they're disempowered, is patriarchy or not, right? This is not a productive way to do this type of research, because then you end up separating people and kind of saying, well, these kids are doing well in school and because of the remittance that is coming in. Yeah, there's studies that will say that the remittance actually helps children in school and where they stay, but there's also research that says that remittances is a lot more about social aspects than actually the educational attainment, right? So again, trying to kind of separate the big data and to really thinking through what they're doing in their homes. So just a few of the images of, you know, the different places where in Puebla, and in this case in Veracruz in Mexico. And again, this is, for example, this is an extremely remote town about 6 hours out of Jalapa. And this is, so this Yani she talks to her mother all the time over text message, right? So you have this particular bond that not necessarily through technology, because maybe even if technology is there, things could be different, but there's also it's motherhood and parenthood facilitated by technology. So if we're thinking about, the work that women are doing in both sides of the border, it stays with this question again of where are the children, right? So you have the feminization of migration, you have the non-community-based migration, so it's kind of going back and forth from different places, and you have mixed status families, right? Which means that people in the same family are documented, U.S. born, sometimes they have DACA, so the deferred action for childhood arrivals, right? That now it's up for grabs in terms of what's going to happen next. So you have these different situations within a family, and mothers have to prioritize and make decisions about who they're going to invest in, right? And that becomes an everyday practice, because what happens is you have kids are going to school, and can they go to college after they're done with high school if they're undocumented? Many of them can, if schools help them navigate that. But the common knowledge is that they can't, but that's the end of the line. So then the parents will say, well, how much do you invest on your education and what you're doing for the kid that is going to school, right? How much do you invest on that versus the money that I get to send back to Mexico and can actually help the kids that stay there, or the kids that were born here and therefore have a different set of opportunities. So they're making these decisions about their kids all the time, and it takes a toll on them in terms of how to be mothers and parents in the US. So for the kids that are in Mexico, they're still thinking that, how are my siblings living in the US, right? And the perception is that they're living this great life because they live in these huge mansions and that they're imagined, right? And how there's money overflowing everywhere. And there's also the discourse of, I don't belong to that family anymore, right? So in a way there's a rupture, because the children that stay there are thinking, my siblings in the US have a lot more money, have a lot more opportunities, and now my mom even gave birth to other kids in New York. So I don't even know if I'm part of that anymore, right? So some of these drawings illustrate their perception on how they think about their sense of belonging in the family. So this is a girl, 12-year-old, and she drew her family, but she drew herself. So she did this drawing when she was 12.